Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
Don't ruin his big day by bringing up your news. That's what my mother whispered into my ear, her voice sugar-coated with that same fake concern she'd been perfecting since I was 10. Her hand, all manicured fingers and barely hidden control, gently squeezed my arm, like she was comforting me, but I felt the message loud and clear. This wasn't my moment, and I'd better keep my mouth shut. The worst part? I didn't even flinch. I just smiled like an idiot and nodded, swallowing down everything I'd wanted to say for weeks. And so I stayed silent, like I always had, like I'd been trained to, like a good daughter is supposed to. The engagement dinner was held at this overpriced restaurant in a part of town where the servers wear gloves and nobody eats the bread because they're too busy pretending they're above carbs. My brother Jack was sitting at the head of the table with his arm around his glowing fiancée, Lauren, who looked like the kind of woman you see on magazine covers. All confidence and poise and effortless perfection. She didn't belong at that table with the rest of us, but somehow she fit into the picture so well it made my stomach twist. Jack was beaming like a damn toothpaste commercial, the kind of beaming that comes naturally when you've never been held accountable for anything in your entire life. Everyone around the table was clapping and toasting and throwing around words like soulmates and meant to be. And I just sat there, quietly sipping a glass of wine I couldn't afford, biting the inside of my cheek so hard it almost bled. A week ago, I found out I was pregnant. Not planned, not even from a steady relationship, but wanted. I was going to keep it, raise the baby, figure it out. And for once in my life, I felt like I had something real to say, something worth being proud of. I thought this dinner would be a chance to share it with the people who, supposedly, loved me. But then came that whisper, and just like that, I was shoved back into the familiar role I'd played my whole life. The quiet, difficult daughter who always picked the wrong moments to speak up. What hit the hardest wasn't the silence, or even the suppression. It was the ease with which she asked me to disappear again. Like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I'd done it before. And the truth is, I had. Too many damn times. I glanced across the table and caught Lauren looking at me, not a quick glance, not polite curiosity. It was something else. It was like she was studying me, trying to read something in my face. She smiled a little too late when our eyes met, and I smiled back, tight, restrained the way you do when you're trying not to let your rage slip out through your teeth. There was something in her expression I couldn't place. Not fear, not guilt, more like unease. And for a moment, I thought maybe she could tell how close I was to losing it. When I was 15, Jack crashed our dad's car while high, and I took the blame. I told them I'd borrowed the keys without asking, even though I didn't even know how to drive yet. My parents were furious, grounded me for a month, took away my phone, told me I was reckless and selfish and disappointing. Jack didn't say a word. Later, when I asked him why he didn't fess up, he just shrugged and said, "They wouldn't have believed me anyway." That was Jack in a nutshell. Golden boy, untouchable, always managing to come out of the mess squeaky clean, while I walked away covered in shit every single time. So when Mom asked me to stay quiet this time, it wasn't a new wound. It was just another scar getting poked. I pushed my plate around with a fork while my father droned on about Jack's new promotion and his spotless credit score like he was reading from a resume. Jack laughed politely, played the humble card, but he was glowing, drunk on praise, basking in it like he expected the world to love him just for showing up. I caught myself wondering if Lauren had ever seen the other side of him, the side that yelled when he didn't get what he wanted, that lied with ease and cleaned up his own messes by pushing them onto someone else. I wondered if she knew how many people he'd burned to get where he was, and if she even cared. I felt my phone buzz in my purse. A message from Kate, my girlfriend, short and sweet. "You okay?" She was the only one who knew I was pregnant, and she was the only one who had encouraged me to tell my family. "They might surprise you," she'd said. I should have known better. My family doesn't surprise. They disappoint on schedule. Somewhere between the third toast and the dessert menu, something shifted. Lauren went quiet. Her posture changed, still poised, but stiffer, like she was preparing for something. She glanced at Jack, then at the rest of the table, and then suddenly she stood up. "I'm sorry, Facade," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the chatter like a sharp knife through silk. "Before we celebrate, I think everyone here deserves to know what Jack's been hiding." And just like that, the room fell completely silent. Forks froze midair. My mother blinked like she hadn't heard correctly. Jack, to his credit, didn't even flinch at first. Just sat there smiling like she was making a joke that hadn't landed. But Lauren wasn't joking. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her face, the perfect glowing face from the engagement photos, was pale. She reached into her purse, and I watched Jack's expression change. Not confusion, not fear, recognition. Right then, something inside me shifted too. My fingers curled into fists under the table, nails digging into my palms. For the first time that night, I didn't feel small. I felt dangerous. And as Lauren's hand came back up, holding what looked like a folded piece of paper, I realized I wasn't the only one who'd been holding a secret. I just hadn't expected her to be the one to start telling the truth. For a long, unbearable moment after Lauren stood up, the room stayed frozen in that perfect, awkward stillness that only comes when a carefully built illusion is seconds away from collapse. And everyone at the table knows it deep in their bones, even if no one's ready to admit it. My mother, with her always composed face cracking slightly around the eyes, turned toward Lauren with the kind of panicked smile you wear when you're trying to keep the ship from sinking without alerting the other passengers that the water's already at their ankles. Jack, still seated, shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening so subtly you might have missed it if you hadn't grown up watching him do that exact thing every time someone got too close to the truth. And me, well, I didn't move at all. I just sat back in my chair, wine glass still in hand, heart pounding so loud in my ears, it nearly drowned out the beginning of Lauren's voice. "I wasn't going to say anything," she began, her voice trembling but somehow steady enough to command the room, "because I figured maybe it wasn't my place. Maybe I should let sleeping dogs lie and trust that people can change. But then I realized, if I'm about to promise my life to someone, I deserve to know who he really is. And maybe all of you do too." Her words didn't come out rushed or panicked. They weren't hysterical or bitter. They had the chilling cadence of someone who'd spent a long time rehearsing them, who had tried and failed to talk herself out of this moment. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a small stack of folded papers, and placed them gently on the table, right next to the untouched slice of chocolate mousse cake someone had been praising a few minutes earlier, as if it were just another side dish to go with the confessions she was about to serve. Jack's face had gone pale. Not white, not ghostly, but that specific shade of beige that signals a man is quietly calculating how fast he can spin a story before the truth fully lands. He leaned forward slightly, his smile gone, his eyes flicking over the papers like they were a loaded weapon, and maybe they were, depending on how much Lauren had uncovered. "I found these when I was transferring some files off Jack's laptop," she said, lifting the top page and holding it delicately between two fingers. "At first, I thought it was some old email junk, but then I started reading, and I couldn't stop. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, and I couldn't believe no one ever said anything." My mother finally spoke, her voice cutting through the silence like a rusty blade, trembling with a mix of fear and fury. "Lauren, honey, whatever that is, we can talk about it later. This really isn't the time or the place." Lauren turned toward her with the kind of glare that suggested she'd expected that exact response, had already built armor against it. "You're right, Susan, it's not the time or the place. But then again, maybe there never would have been one, because it's clear you've all gotten very good at pretending this didn't happen." She placed the page face up in front of Jack, and then stepped back, her hands folded in front of her like she was delivering evidence in a courtroom. "She was 19, Lauren said, her voice harder now, colder. "You were 23. She was a freshman at your university, Jack. And these are the messages you sent her. The ones where you convinced her not to tell anyone. The ones where you promised it was just a misunderstanding. The ones where you said no one would believe her, that her reputation would be ruined. I felt my stomach twist into something ugly and hot, because I recognized those words, not because I'd read them before, but because I'd heard them whispered, seen them echoed in the way Jack had always moved through life, untouchable, bulletproof, never once having to deal with the wreckage he left behind. He didn't deny it. Not at first. He just sat there, staring at the papers, blinking slowly like he was waiting for the script to change, like maybe the scene was just a detour, and soon the spotlight would shift back where it belonged, to his success, his charm, his glowing future. "Is this true?" my father finally asked, his voice dry and hoarse, like the words themselves had been dragged from his throat. He didn't look angry, he looked tired, like a man who'd known for a long time that something didn't quite add up, but had been too cowardly to look too closely. Jack laughed. Not a loud, bold laugh, but the kind that drips with condescension, meant to disarm rather than entertain. "Come on, Dad, this is ancient history. It was stupid, sure, but nothing happened. She was just some girl with a crush." Lauren's hand slammed the table before he could finish, the sound sharp enough to make several people jump. "Don't," she said through clenched teeth. "Don't you dare minimize this. I talked to her. Her name is Sarah, by the way, not some girl. She remembers everything. She never forgot. She just got tired of screaming into a void." My mother looked like she was about to faint, but I noticed something else too. She wasn't shocked. She was afraid, yes, embarrassed, but not surprised. That was the worst part. Her eyes darted toward me, and for the first time all evening, she looked like she might speak to me directly, but I stared right back at her, unblinking, unflinching, and I think she understood that nothing she could say would fix what was unraveling now. Everyone else at the table was silent, too stunned or too scared to move. Jack muttered something under his breath, a mixture of apology and excuse, but I barely heard it over the pounding in my chest. Lauren sat back down, her face blank, her posture still elegant, but you could see in her eyes that something inside her had died tonight. Not just the relationship, but the fantasy. I felt rage bubbling up beneath my skin, not just at Jack, but at all of them, for what they'd allowed, for what they'd ignored, for what they'd made me swallow over the years while they polished his crown. And then I heard myself speak, my voice soft but clear, slicing through the quiet like a blade wrapped in velvet. That's not the worst of it. All eyes turned to me, even Lauren, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one carrying someone else's shame. I was just getting started. The air in that room turned heavy, dense, almost suffocating in the seconds following my quiet sentence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, but like pressure building inside a sealed pipe right before it bursts. And all those carefully balanced faces around the table, faces of a family so damn good at lying to themselves, began to shift ever so slightly, eyes widening, lips parting, fingers twitching nervously against wine glasses and linen napkins, because they knew, even before I opened my mouth again, that the spell had finally broken, that something dark and long buried was clawing its way to the surface, and this time, I wasn't going to protect anyone from it. I looked at Jack, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear on his face. Not fear of consequences, not fear of being found out, but fear of me, of what I might say, of the part of the truth he couldn't control anymore. He opened his mouth, probably to deflect, to cut me off with some half-baked excuse or deflection, but I raised my hand, just a fraction, and he froze, like a deer who's finally realized the headlights are not swerving. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'd waited too long, swallowed too much, sacrificed too many damn pieces of myself, to let emotion crack the edges of what I was about to say. "You remember Sarah," I said slowly, deliberately, letting each word sink in like a stone dropping into still water. "But I doubt you remember what she told me, because you were never the one listening back then. I was." I turned toward the others at the table, the people who had always chosen to see Jack through rose-colored glasses smeared with their own expectations and blind loyalty. Sarah called me 2 days after the night it happened. She didn't know who else to talk to. She was scared and confused. And you know what? So was I, because she told me things about Jack, about that night, that I didn't want to believe at first, because even though I'd seen what he was capable of, I still thought there had to be some limit, some line he wouldn't cross. Jack shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath about me being dramatic, but I ignored him, didn't even glance in his direction, because he didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was the truth finally bleeding into the open. She told me he got her drunk, I continued, my voice still measured but sharper now, like a scalpel, and that he kept pushing even after she said no, that he laughed when she cried, said she was being too sensitive. She told me he apologized the next day, but not really, just enough to make her feel crazy for even being upset, just enough to plant doubt in her own mind. And then he started messaging her, over and over, reminding her how no one would believe her, how she'd ruin her own life if she said anything. I let those words hang there for a moment, not because I needed the drama, but because I wanted them to land with their full, disgusting weight. My father's face had gone pale, his lips tight, his hands clenched on the table like he was bracing for an earthquake. And maybe he should have been, because what I was about to say would level whatever illusions he had left. I told Mom, I said, turning to her slowly, meeting her eyes without blinking. The day Sarah called me, I went to her. I told her what I'd heard, what Jack had done, and you know what she said? My voice cracked then, just for a second, but I pushed through it. She said Sarah was just trying to bring our family down, that she was probably jealous or looking for attention. She told me to forget about it, to keep my mouth shut, and when I didn't, when I kept asking questions, she grounded me, told me I was being disrespectful, accused me of trying to ruin Jack's future out of spite. A collective gasp rippled through the table, subtle but unmistakable, as the pristine surface of our family's lie began to collapse inward. My mother looked like she'd been slapped, her mouth open but no words coming out, because how do you defend burying something like that? How do you justify choosing one child's comfort over another woman's trauma? I dropped out of college that year, I added, because if I was going to bleed, I might as well do it all at once. You all thought I just couldn't handle the pressure, that I was flaking out again. But the truth was, I couldn't stand to be part of a family that protected a predator and made me feel like the villain for calling it out. I walked away because every room in this house felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Jack, innocent. Me, bitter and unstable. Lauren, still seated beside me, was staring at me now with a mixture of horror and something else, respect maybe, or understanding. But it was the silence from the others that was most deafening. They didn't deny it. No one jumped up to defend Jack. Not even him. He just sat there, eyes cast down, like he knew there was no salvaging the golden boy illusion anymore. You think I stayed quiet all these years because I was scared? I asked, turning to Jack now, finally letting my fury rise to the surface. No, I stayed quiet because I was tired. Because every time I tried to speak, someone like Mom would whisper in my ear and remind me whose story mattered more. But not tonight, not anymore. And in that moment, with the weight of every silenced truth finally out in the open, I felt something break free inside me, not just the guilt or the shame, but the twisted sense of loyalty that had kept me tethered to people who had never truly seen me. I had bled for this family, bent myself into shapes so small and quiet, I forgot what it felt like to breathe without fear of being accused of stealing someone else's light. Now, I was done shrinking, and the look on Jack's face told me he knew it too. The room, thick with the weight of unraveling lies and collapsing illusions, hung suspended in that unbearable stillness that follows a storm, not yet fully past but no longer contained. As though every person seated around the long, beautifully set table had just realized they'd been dining atop a minefield, and someone, finally, had dared to stomp. Jack, for all his lifelong charm and inherited confidence, no longer looked like the center of anything. His perfect posture slumped, his eyes cast down, and that polished, always in control expression that had once won over every teacher, every boss, every family friend, now reduced to a thin, cracking mask stretched too tightly across a face that could no longer pretend not to know fear. He didn't speak, not immediately, perhaps calculating, perhaps hoping the silence itself would buy him time to figure out which version of himself would be most forgivable in this moment. It was our father who finally broke the silence, though his voice came out slower, heavier, more brittle than I'd ever heard it, like a man confronting a truth he'd been expertly dodging for too many years and suddenly found himself cornered by it. "Is this true, Jack?" he asked, though the question felt less like a plea for information and more like a last gasp of denial, the kind you offer yourself when the evidence is staring you down, but you still want someone, anyone, to tell you it's not what it looks like. Jack looked up then, not at Dad but at me, and I saw it, something I hadn't seen in his face since we were kids. It wasn't guilt, and it definitely wasn't remorse. It was resentment. The kind of deep, primal hatred reserved for the one person in your life who knows exactly who you are beneath all the gloss and pretense. And when he finally spoke, it came out sharp, bitter, and entirely devoid of shame. "You've always hated me," he said, his voice low but firm, that old accusatory tone slipping through like venom. "Every single time I've done something good, every single time people looked at me with respect. You were right there in the background, sulking, waiting for me to mess up. You couldn't stand it, that I got everything you couldn't, that Mom and Dad actually believed in me. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so pathetically predictable, the kind of defensive nonsense only someone who's been protected their entire life would throw out in a room full of wreckage they caused. I didn't respond, though, not yet, because I wanted him to feel the weight of his words in the air, to hear how weak and transparent they sounded when not cushioned by years of parental excuses and adoration. Lauren, still seated beside him but now with her body angled subtly away, like she couldn't bear to touch even the air around him, turned to face him fully, her voice soft but unnervingly controlled. "You lied to me," she said, and there was a rawness to it that no one could dismiss, not even Jack. "And worse than that, you made me feel like I was crazy for asking questions. Every time I got close to something, you shut me down with that same smug tone. I thought I was being paranoid, but you were just being careful." Jack tried to reach for her hand, but she pulled it away, not with anger, but with a kind of finality that was somehow more cutting than any slap across the face. "You don't get to act like a victim now," she added. "Not after this. Not after what I found, not after what she said," she added, nodding toward me. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, and with a hand so steady it was almost eerie, she took off her engagement ring and placed it beside her untouched champagne glass. The sound it made, that tiny metallic click against the crystal base, felt louder than anything else that had been said so far. My mother began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, but that tight, silent kind of weeping that you do when everything you've built your identity around starts to rot in front of you. And for the first time, I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel pity or regret or even vindication. I just felt tired. Tired of playing the villain in a story where the real monster always walked away unscathed. "You want to talk about jealousy?" I finally said, turning to Jack with a calm that surprised even me. "I wasn't jealous of you. I pitied you, because all you ever had was their approval. You never built anything real on your own. You needed them to lie for you, to coddle you, to clean up every mess you made. And you still ended up like this, a grown man blaming his sister for the consequences of his own actions." I looked around the table, at the stunned faces of aunts and cousins who had once called me difficult or sensitive in those hushed voices you use when the person you're criticizing is in the next room. And I didn't offer them comfort either. I wasn't there to make anyone feel better. Not this time. My mother reached for me then, her voice choked and trembling. Please, sweetheart, this doesn't have to be how we remember this day. I stared at her hand like it was a stranger's. You whispered to me not to ruin his big day, I said, slow and clear. But maybe someone should have whispered to you years ago when you decided protecting him was more important than protecting anyone else. Then I turned to Lauren, whose face had hardened into something unrecognizable, something resolute, and before anyone else could speak, she said, in that same chillingly even voice, "There's one more thing I haven't told you all." The room didn't breathe. Not one person moved. And just like that, we all knew this wasn't the end. It was only the middle of the unraveling. There's a strange kind of silence that descends when a family has been hollowed out by truth, not the peaceful kind that follows understanding or healing, but the dense, suffocating quiet of emotional debris, the heavy fog that rolls in after a long-held illusion has shattered, and no one quite knows how to sweep up the shards without cutting themselves in the process. That was the silence we sat in, a thick, palpable stillness that pressed against the walls of the dining room like a second skin, as all eyes turned to Lauren, who, despite the tidal wave of emotion that had already crashed over this night, still had something else buried behind her eyes, something she had not yet said, something she had held back until the weight of all the other revelations finally made space for one more. She didn't raise her voice or stand with any dramatic flair this time. She simply reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and with a quiet calm that only made the tension worse, tapped a few buttons before holding it up in her hand. Not to show anyone, not to play anything, but just to indicate that whatever came next was not speculation or memory or interpretation, but evidence. I reached out to Sarah, Lauren said, her voice not trembling now, but tempered with that kind of cool anger that burns cleaner than any scream. I wanted to hear her story, to understand it from her, not just from old emails or from the fragments Jack couldn't explain away. It took a few days for her to agree, and when she finally did, she told me everything. What happened that night, what happened afterward, how she was warned not to make noise, how she felt like screaming into a void, how it destroyed her college experience, her friendships, her sense of self. Jack made a sound then, low and defensive, as if to object, but Lauren didn't even glance at him. And then she said something that stuck with me, she continued, her voice dropping slightly. She said, "The worst part wasn't the night itself. It was how quickly he moved on, how easily everyone let him." I felt that sentence like a punch to the chest, because I had lived it too, in a different way. In the countless moments where I had watched Jack walk through life with a kind of unearned grace, shielded from consequence, cocooned in praise, while those of us who saw the cracks were treated like threats to the family order. And now, finally, the dam had broken, and no one could pretend the water wasn't rising. Lauren looked at my mother, then my father, then back at Jack. "She's ready to come forward," she said flatly. "She's not hiding anymore. She has a lawyer. She's giving her statement to the school's Title IX office and to the police. And whether or not they can charge you with anything now, your name will be there, in a file, in a record, in her words. You're not invisible anymore." The only sound in the room was the slow, measured breathing of a family trying not to fall apart in front of each other. Jack didn't yell, didn't deny it, didn't even cry. He just leaned back in his chair like a man who had finally run out of excuses and found nothing left to prop up the mask he'd worn his entire life. And for a moment, I felt something close to pity. But it passed as quickly as it came, because whatever pain he felt now was a fraction of what he'd inflicted. And I had no sympathy left to spend on people who only felt remorse when they were cornered. My mother, who had spent the better part of my life bending reality to preserve this fragile image of her perfect son, sat with her face in her hands, sobbing softly, not for the victims, not for me, but for the unraveling of the story she had sold to the world, that she had clung to like a lifeboat, while the rest of us drowned quietly beneath her. And as she wept, my father reached for her, not to comfort, but to silence, his hand gripping her wrist gently but firmly, as if to say, "Enough, it's done." I stood up then, not with a grand gesture or any words of vindication, but simply because I couldn't sit there another second surrounded by the ruins of a family that had always valued silence over justice. I stepped away from the table, away from the tears and the shame and the half-whispered apologies that were just now beginning to take shape in the mouths of those who had spent years pretending not to hear. Outside, the night had turned colder, the sky thick with clouds that hung low and heavy like the weight of everything we had left unsaid for too long. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat inside without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, calm, and I realized I wasn't trembling anymore. There was no anxiety, no regret, just a kind of numb clarity, like the moment after a deep breath when your lungs are finally empty and quiet. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the small velvet box I'd placed there earlier that day, back when I still believed I might have a moment to share my own news. It wasn't expensive or flashy, just a simple silver band nestled in dark fabric, waiting for a moment that would never come. I had planned to propose to Kate tonight. We had talked about it, danced around it, laughed about how it would happen someday. And I had chosen tonight, foolishly believing that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim a piece of the spotlight without stealing it, that I could share joy without igniting someone else's shame. Instead, I sat there in the silence, staring at the ring, knowing I would wait, because this wasn't a night for beginnings. It was a night for endings, or maybe, if I was being honest, for truth. My phone buzzed in the center console. A message lit up the screen, just 2 words. Thank you. No name, but I didn't need one. I knew who it was. And in that moment, sitting alone in the quiet of a parked car outside a ruined dinner party, I finally felt what I hadn't felt in years. Seen. I looked back at the house once, just once, and whispered into the stillness, not as a curse, not even as a farewell, but as a promise to myself more than anyone else. Maybe I wasn't the black sheep. Maybe I was just the only one who stopped lying. And with that, I turned the key in the ignition and drove off into the night, leaving behind not a family, but a story that no longer needed my silence to survive.